I was walking through the woods with two friends, one that has lived in Central America and one that's only lived in the US. And the one that's only lived in the US was like, I want to go to the rainforest so bad. And the other one was like, just walk around here during the summer. It's basically basically the same thing. I mean, it's not, but it's so much of it is so similar. I mean, I've been
I think one of the things we say quite often as animal keepers, especially as reptile keepers, is that we do it to connect with nature. And I think that is true. But I also believe that can sometimes lead us askew or astray, and we start focusing on the reptile room being nature when it's not. The reptile room has elements of nature, but to actually experience nature, you have to go outside and experience nature. I know that sounds simple, but a lot of us aren't doing that, and there's just so much value you can learn from that experience. So today, my guest, Nathan Carlos Rupley, discusses the concept of rewilding himself as an individual. What does that mean? What does it mean to sort of shed some of this consumerism behavior that we have as people in North America or in the West and start to engage in more hunter-gatherer type behavior, and how that process has allowed him to become a better reptile keeper. Nathan has a tremendous amount of experience just being in nature and observing things, and we spent a lot of time discussing how that has changed his concept of reptile keeping. And we also discuss foraging for wild plants and how that actually has allowed him to look at feeding reptiles on a more holistic level. I think this is a very nuanced and fascinating episode, and it's probably something that many of us don't think about. I know for sure, even though I love being in nature, I don't do it enough, and I don't do it intentionally enough. Even when I'm in nature, I don't think I'm actually paying attention. And this is an episode that will have you paying attention to nature, which will in turn have huge benefits for your reptile room. Enjoy the episode, and I will talk to you after. This podcast is all about improving your reptile husbandry. However, I know not everybody has the time or the money to go out and spend thousands of dollars doing custom builds. Thankfully, friend of the podcast, Josh Halter, aka the Bio Dude, is working hard to make better care more accessible. He makes turnkey bioactive kits for leopard geckos, ball pythons, tortoises, invertebrates, dart frogs, and the list continues to grow. He has spent years testing and perfecting these handcrafted substrates and dietary supplements to create the most effective products. If you visit thebiodude.com, you will see he is a proud supporter of both USARK and responsible reptile keeping, and there is an option to donate to either at checkout. Awesome. Well, Nathan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I think you have a ton of just, I think, unique experience, we can call it. I think the way you approach your, even just life, but your approach, your connection with nature and connection with animals, I think it's probably what a lot of people aspire to do, but you're actually out there doing the things, being in the wild and foraging plants and whatnot. So I really want to get into that. But let's just start with, let's give people a kind of a foundation of how would you describe your connection with nature as it is today?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. I've had a pretty crazy life, and I feel a little bit split between rewilding and keeping animals in little glass boxes. Although there's actually a lot more overlap than people in either camp might understand. But yeah, I basically I teach foraging classes here and there, rewilding in general. I'm a stay-at-home dad, and one of my hobbies is keeping mostly invertebrates, but a few reptiles.
Yeah, and that is the hard balance, right? When you're someone who's really a pure naturalist, likes to be outside, likes to interact with Mother Nature herself, but then also have this temptation to keep on the inside. And yeah. I mean, that's kind of like the struggle of this entire podcast, is whether or not this is the right thing to do. So is that a kind of a ebb and flow you've gone through as well?
Well, yeah, it's kind of recently it's been an ebb and flow. Before, it's been pretty hard in either direction. So, I mean, I guess just really briefly, I grew up in Kenya and Burkina Faso, as well as semi-rural Pennsylvania. And, early memories being 3 years old and finding Jackson's chameleons at school, like just on a tree stump. You know, Nile monitors, like um uh like foot long millipedes inside a tree, like probably like 50 of them inside this giant hollow tree. Just
Wow.
all kinds of stuff. And then for junior high, being brought back to Pennsylvania and uh not ever fitting into this culture and having to deal with winter and not as many reptiles and invertebrates. But so, like junior high and high school, I had a paper route that paid for a reptile collection that was way too big for my bedroom, and um, I spent more money on buying animals than on providing proper care. And also, that was, this was back in the 90s, early to mid 90s. There wasn't anything on the internet. I was relying on like whatever they told me at the pet store and whatever some book from the 70s in the local library would tell me. So yeah,
Do you
I
think
was
that
really into keeping
do you think that you
yeah,
had this foundation in Africa as a young child? And
yeah,
it's very weird to think of someone who's grown up in North America. We think of Africa as an exotic place; it's somewhere foreign. But it must be strange the fact that that's where you existed initially. So when you come to North America, that's such a, like you said, there's cultural difference, but then also even just the wildlife. And do you think that was part of the reason
yeah.
that you gravitated towards keeping, because you had this sort of foundation of being in Africa?
Yeah. So exotic to me was going to a grocery store, like
Right, right.
just seeing these like aisles, going to the mall and all the consumerism. And I grew up mostly in the city, but it, it was fairly undeveloped in a lot of ways, and I spent a lot of time in small villages, mud huts and stuff like that. And coming back here, everything was a huge shock, and I've never really been comfortable with consumerism. I mean, I'm more comfortable with it now than I ever have been, but I don't like it. Um, and yeah, I guess both in terms of getting to be around wildlife, but also just to throw it out there, I'm neurodivergent, and so not only did I have culture shock coming back to the U.S., but I'm not always great with people anyway, or at least not in the way like many people are. And so, yeah, I think I stuffed my room full of as many big reptiles as I could to like have like uh creatures around me that didn't judge me for being different, and to fill like an emotional hole. And I had way too many, and I was already struggling to take care of all of them. And then I got into like partying and drugs and punk rock and all of that. So I had to get rid of as many as I could as fast as I could because I knew I wasn't taking care of them. But the pet shops didn't even want all of them back. And so a few of them ended up dying because I wasn't taking care of them, because I wasn't taking care of myself.
Mhm.
And so I said, I'm done keeping reptiles. I'm done keeping animals at all. I'm I have to learn how to take care of myself before that. And so I crashed and burned and did way too many drugs and spent a couple decades trying to get my head back together.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't keep any animals during that time. But then my kids wanted some guinea pigs, and so we were taking care of them well. And then like the pandemic happened, and I started watching a lot of reptile and invert YouTube, and so I started getting inverts and a couple reptiles, and I started to build um, my collection up slowly compared to a lot of people. But for my personal mental health, I built it up too much, too fast. Even though, like compared to so many people in the hobby, I was so conservative about not getting more than I could handle. But I had a few things go wrong in my collection, kind of all within the same few months, where my fish got sick, the other fish like all killed each other, like uh um I was concerned that maybe I had spread they had a fish TV that I had spread that to other parts of my collection by using water to, because I'm so holistic, I used water to water plants in other
Mm.
enclosures. I think I'm good on all that, but I had my long-tailed grass lizards had 8 babies over the course of 2 months, and all of them would look like they were doing fine, and then they failed to thrive, and just one by one they'd drop off. Uh, and so I like the very thing that was like helping me with my mental health during the early pandemic, like started being a source of stress. And so I was taking care of the animals, but just the like bare minimum. I was just so depressed and couldn't really face like the animal room. I finally worked through that, and I've downsized my collection by a lot. Um, so yeah, it has been ebbs and flows. I also kind of took a break from rewilding for the most part there, and have gotten back into it more recently.
Yeah, I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. Is I always talk about the benefits of keeping animals and why that is good for your mental health. Giving, especially if you're neurodivergent, but I can absolutely relate to the stress and the almost depression that comes with when things aren't going well in the room, and it just makes you want to not do it at all.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I think when I first got this Japanese rat snake, and he just went on like a hunger strike for like 3 months, and he was just so small, and he's fine now. But during that time, it just made me like almost not like reptile keeping at all, because it was like every
Yep.
time I came down here, I would see him, and it would just be the first thing I think about and the last thing I think about when I left, and I felt guilty, and I'm like, why are we doing this? And that's a really hard thing to go through.
Yeah. And then of course all of that was kind of happening, same time as I already struggle with the way a lot of herpetoculture is done in terms of keeping in small enclosures and keeping tons of animals, but the slither files was
Mm.
happening, and I was seeing, a lot of advancement in it, but also a lot of pushback to that, and the whole thing I was just like just done with. But there's a certain aspect of it that I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully shake. And even when I was like downsizing my collection, I was still like watching tons of YouTube videos, and part of what we'll probably discuss, being in Facebook groups and discussing the diet of um, especially Uromastyx, even though I haven't owned one since the 90s. But I was kind of, doing a deep dive into that, and just relating it to my own like knowledge of foraging and plant medicine and all of that.
Yeah, yeah. So why don't you bring us up to speed with what you're actually keeping right now, both reptiles and inverts?
Yeah, in terms of reptiles, at the current moment, I only have two long-tailed grass lizards.
Okay.
Recently, I had a Urodactylodes that was sold to me as agricole, but when I posted pictures in the one group, there was huge debate over whether it was a different species or a hybrid or whatever. So I moved that on to a good home. Really happy with that. And then in terms of inverts, um, I've got little Kenyan roaches and dubia roaches, uh, curly-haired tarantula, and then my son has a vinegaroon, but I basically take care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
cool. Well, you've mentioned rewilding a couple of times, and I would love to dive into that.
yeah,
So I imagine most know what it is, but maybe you could kind of give us a definition or what your definition of that is, and then I'd love to talk about how that practice is manifesting in your life.
yeah. So basically, it's reversing the process of domestication is the beginning part of one of the most popular definitions of it. It goes a little beyond that, but basically, it's an attempt to move back at least as much as possible to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, or at least to bring those old ways forward with us. to whatever degree we can. I used to be really black and white about it, but I've gotten a lot more nuanced over the years. Um, so yeah, I guess cultures have rewilded in one way or another for thousands of years. Ever since cultures moved away from being wild, they've run into roadblocks and discovered problems with civilization and moved away from it. As much as our culture likes to kind of view stuff as like this progression towards more and more civilization, really it's more cycles. And it has moved in a somewhat linear way, but many cultures have moved away from it. One thing I do want to give a disclaimer on everything I'm talking about here is, but for one, I'm not endorsing other people in any of the movements that I talk about. There's a lot of great people that do a lot of great work. There's also a lot of attitudes that I don't like in all of it. Any circles you go in, there's going to be people that are grifters or whatever you want to say, and so don't just go out and look up any rewilding person and be like, oh, this is exactly what Nate's talking about. It used to be like all of us were anarchists and probably on all kinds of lists, and gradually over the years, kind of like health influencers kind of moved in, and I feel like they're starting to move out again. It was kind of a fad in some circles. And those people brought some important good things with them, but they also brought a lot of stuff that basically our culture has a very surface level idea of what wildness is, and you can like learn a lot of stuff that about like hunter gatherers, and then like totally misapply it when trying to like apply it to our culture just based on misunderstanding stuff. And then just I'm a student of all of this. I'm also a teacher of a lot of it, but the things I say, some of them are things that I very strongly believe are true, but trying to actually, it's easy to come up with a theory and like back it up with research and all of that, but then actually applying it, there's all kinds of risks involved, to yourself, to your animals or whatever. And I don't want to be here acting like every idea that I put forth, you can just straightforward apply it. It's all a mix of art and science.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. So in general, is it the idea of trying to shed some of this? I mean, you mentioned some of the consumerism and things like that, and just kind of simplify your life in a way, or look for ways in your life that you can connect with nature in a more ancestral way?
Yeah, that's kind of an entry point for a lot of people. For me, I believe that immediate return hunter-gatherer lifestyles are the most egalitarian. Consistently, those cultures are extremely good at not allowing anybody to rule over anybody else. And so for me, there's a philosophical aspect to it that's very important. But just in general, yeah, I mean, I guess just to really quickly to say that, I grew up in Africa, came back and felt very disconnected. I did have a creek behind our house that I spent lots of time at, but I had no idea that you could rewild. I thought you had to go someplace where there already were people living closer to nature. And I'm an artist too, and I was working at a copy center, like a corporate copy center, completely miserable, but needed the money. And I was working, and this guy came in to get copies made, like flyers made for a class he was teaching, and he had hunter gatherer tattooed on his hands. like hunter on one and gatherer on the other. And I was like, oh, that's funny. Like, like shoot tattoos. And he's like, no, like I'm serious. And so he's like, come to my class and like we can talk about this. And so he taught me my first few plants, and about a little bit about bow making and stuff like that.
Oh, nice sticker.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got a that's a
Beauty.
really good quality sticker too.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I have no control over the quality because it comes from Patreon. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
cool.
I've been really impressed that it's very water resistant.
Awesome.
So yeah, from that guy, I found out about a couple foraging books, especially Sam Thayer is best foraging author out there. There's a few others that are really close, but his work really inspired me. I would sit there in the break room, like at work, reading about like how to like gather your own food, and then on the weekends, like go into the woods behind my parents' old house and see what I could find. And yeah, I it became my obsession for about a decade.
Well, it's quite an
Yeah,
interesting mindset shift, I imagine, because suddenly, like you said, even though you're not keen on the consumerism, because you are here, you take part in it, you go to the grocery store, you walk down the aisles, you throw your packaged food in the cart, and you sort of forget that there's actually still a lot of nature out there, that it's not there, it's just that you're not seeing it because we walk on the concrete sidewalk to go to the grocery store and walk home. But there's a lot of supplies and a lot of food and other things that you can gather that are out there. You just have to go do it. So is that kind of how it started for you? Like just getting out there, gathering plants and just learning what you can eat off the land?
yeah. Although, yeah, my first emphasis was on learning how to identify them,
Mm.
and then going from there, slowly, tasting a little bit here and there, and then moving towards more. And yeah, I mean, it was just a real learning experience, a whole mindset shift. And you know, I don't. Most people probably don't know this, but like a huge number of the weeds and invasives that are all over the place are edible and medicinal. And you have to be careful because of pollution, but it's not like you have to go out into the middle of the wilderness. I almost never go out into the middle of the wilderness. Right now, we're lucky we live in a cabin on a farm that has a lot of woods. But even when we were living in a little apartment building, you're walking. I mean, all these people are spraying their lawns, so you can't really eat them, but you can learn about like all these like amazing plants that are just growing out of the cracks in the sidewalks and in people's lawns and all of that. So yeah, it's really crazy.
So what is a lot of the plants that you can gather, are they more medicinal? Like are there any things that are actually like substantial that you can eat and actually get full from? Or is it most like, I think like dandelion, I know that's an invasive that I think has a lot of medicinal values or qualities to it. Maybe you could list some other plants as well. Again, obviously the caveat, just don't go run out and eat everything that you find. But
Yeah.
are there
Yeah.
things that you can eat that fill you up?
Yeah, there are, but it's there's a reason why you hear about hunter gatherers, not gatherers. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
meat. If you're gonna live wild, yeah, like really like subsist off of the land, you're gonna eat from every kingdom that you can.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. But yeah, so the 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 majority of plants that are edible are herbs or salad greens or something like that, and they're extremely healthful. Um, some of them taste really good. Some you have to get used to. We're not used to as many bitter plants as there are, but those are really good for you. But most wild plants that you can find, you use more calories gathering them than you do eating them. And then a lot of them actually, help you detoxify, but that like makes it in a survival situation, you wouldn't want to be eating a ton of dandelion, especially the leaves. The root maybe could help, but yeah. So then you have to learn to focus in on um, fruits, nuts, roots, and tubers and stuff like that. That's where the real calories are, and not every plant is really worth it in terms of trying to survive. But in terms of health, most of them are really worthwhile.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so then it becomes hunting and fishing and acquiring protein through ways that anybody who's a hunter
Yeah,
can do. Yeah,
fish traps are really important if you're trying to survive, because you can be gathering plants and whatnot while your fish trap is just catching a bunch of fish for you.
yeah,
The
that
other
makes
the
sense.
other thing with the plants is that you have to kind of learn the cycle of the seasons. So during the winter, the plants send their energy underground. There might still be a few fruits and a few nuts that you can find during the winter, even here in Pennsylvania. But most of the plant's energy goes down into its roots. A lot of the plants die back. In spring, there's spring ephemerals that come up early. Those are great nutritionally, but they don't provide many calories. Um, the roots are still really good in the early spring, and then stuff starts to send up shoots, kind of like asparagus.
Mm.
The young shoot that pops up, and you can break it off and eat it, and then flowers, and then fruit, and then nuts, and then it all starts over again.
Yeah. So it gives you a way more depth of understanding of the landscape and of the world that you live in, which is probably one of the huge benefits of it. And so I'm curious how this practice has changed your concept of keeping animals in captivity, because obviously you're spending time understanding the landscape, understanding how Mother Nature flows from season to season, and then you're keeping animals inside. So has it affected that at all?
Yeah, it has. I allow my animals to have night drops way more than I used to. Um, Provide much larger, more natural enclosures for them. I really think about their need to move around. Part of rewilding is not just gathering food from the landscape, but it's learning how to duck under, vault over, like you know, hop from rock to rock and all of that. And so, one thing I only half jokingly have talked about with some keepers is um, how a lot of keepers and are very strongly against anthropomorphism. I've talked about evidence-based anthropomorphism, kind of tongue in cheek, but actually, I really as a tracker and somebody that moves uh through the woods like an animal, trying to get yourself into their head, and as somebody with sensory issues but also sensory gifts, I think maybe it's easier for me to put myself into not exactly, but some sort of an approximation of an animal's like mindset as they're moving throughout the day.
Hmm.
And so I try and provide even for animals that maybe aren't like from a woods or a jungle or something like that. Even if I'm not providing tall branches for them to climb or whatnot, just trying to provide anything. Um, on the one hand, anything that might lead them to go in certain circles around the enclosure, but then also that encourage them to have to go over or under or whatever um, to just to get that exercise. Because I know for me personally, when I'm not getting exercise, I feel terrible. And even if even if these animals aren't able to do like calculus or whatnot, they have emotions. Even if they're different emotions than ours, they still have them, and the science would back it up. Like
Yeah.
like if you look at tarantulas, these are animals whose basic body structure evolved before dinosaurs were around, and yet I can look at a tarantula and I don't know what it's thinking most of the time, but when it gives me a threat pose, I know what's going on in that animal's mind, and I know what it's trying to communicate to me.
Exactly.
And I know from reading studies that they have the same, even though they may not, there's debate over what they have technically qualifies as a brain. They still have the same basic like chemicals that we have in our brain that controls our mood, and it seems pretty obvious that something is going on there. It doesn't have to be exactly like a human for it to be relatable to some degree or other.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, because I think we tend to overlook that because there's a lot of innate communication that happens between us and animals that you don't even really think about it. And I mean, you think about a threat pose or a tarantula, you immediately know that what that is. Like you step back.
Even people that don't know tarantulas.
Exactly. So you just know that, and it's like, yeah, it's showing you its fangs. So it makes perfect sense. And there's we are animals, and we have the ability to communicate with animals on that level. Even something as quote unquote basic as a tarantula, there's still a level of communication that can happen between you and it, which is really amazing. And unless there are people who are totally oblivious to these things, and those are the people that get like kicked by horses and stuff because they just don't know how to read an animal's behavior. Or I saw someone sent me the other day a video of somebody getting mauled by a moose, basically because they went up to a wild moose, and it's like it gave you 20 signs before you tried to touch it that it did not want you touching it, and they still went up and went, oh, I'm going to touch it, and then it did not end well. But for the most part, if people actually connect with themselves, they can innately communicate with animals in that way. And I think that's such a good point. And I think even the point that you raised about creating the wild environment and the skill set that it takes to maneuver through a wild environment is a level of fitness that we don't, you don't often think about, or we try to encourage when it comes to keeping animals in captivity, but you can actually give yourself a better in-depth understanding of that by just being in the wild yourself. And it doesn't have to be the actual native habitat of that animal. I can go walk through the boreal forest of northern Canada and have an understanding of what it might be like in New Caledonia just because I'm surrounding myself in the wild. It's not exactly like it, but it's close enough where you can relate to the animal that way.
Yeah. And I was walking through the woods with two friends, one that has lived in Central America and one that's only lived in the US. And the one that's only lived in the US was like, I want to go to the rainforest so bad. And the other one was like, just walk around here during the summer. It's basically the same thing. I mean, it's not, but it's so much of it is so similar. I mean, I've been to rainforests and deserts and all kinds of places, and there's it's not the same thing here, but you can find places that are really similar locally, almost anywhere you live at a certain time of year or a certain habitat. It's just like, I have some ancestry that's native to northeastern Mexico and South Texas, and in the Northeast we have the same kinds of cactus that they have down there, like the prickly pear cactus. We have very similar species here, but here they live on like rock faces and stuff like that. So there's so much you can take something close to you and try and understand an approximation of another habitat.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's something about
also cities. If you're trying to understand the future of ecosystems, go to a city because it's 10 degrees hotter and it's arid and it's mostly invasives and weeds. It's just, there's so many connections that you can make.
The best part about providing high-quality reptile husbandry is you get to develop a long-term relationship with your animal. Meet Jackson, my 18-year-old crested gecko. Jackson lives on the BioDude's Terra Fauna substrate, which is one of their substrates that's specifically designed for warm biomes and humidity spikes. Like all other BioDude substrates, it contains organic content to help support the plant life in Jackson's vivarium. It also holds moisture very well, which means humidity is never an issue, even in my dry climate. Another favorite of mine is the BioDudes Bug Grub. This is a supplement powder made from natural ingredients like carrots, beets, spirulina, oats, and potatoes. Everybody knows how important gut-loading feeder insects is, and this simplifies it for me and allows me to be confident when I feed both Jackson and my tarantulas that they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. Also, if you have a lot of babies right now, this is a great way to help fortify the diets of neonatal reptiles. The BioDude has a ton of great educational content on both his YouTube channel and the website, all about bioactive care, and it's just one of those brands that's doing their part to push herpetoculture into a positive direction and give reptile keeping a better name. Yeah, it's so true. And there's something about our brain when we're in a novel environment that seems so much more brilliant than when you're in an environment that you're used to. But you're right. It's like if you actually just step back and see the native habitat that you're in, if you're in a wild area, it's just as incredible as anywhere else. Something like in Manitoba, because I live in the Great Plains, we have these tremendous clouds that I just thought that everybody's clouds look like that. But in the summertime, we have these enormous clouds, and we'd have people that come from the coast, and they're like, look at your clouds. I cannot believe, like, those people who grew up in the coast just assumed that clouds that look like that were just in animations and cartoons. And they're like, that's what these look like. And I guess that is pretty cool. Now that I look at it, it's like these amazing clouds, but you don't really pay attention to it because you've been around it your whole life.
That's one of the things that I try and teach is for people to look at the things. When you first start learning about plants, like a lot of times you just see this fuzzy wall of green, and then each one you become friends with, it's just like, if you know somebody, you develop a search pattern for their face, and like you'll recognize, even if you don't remember their name or whatever, you're going to recognize that person once you've got that like face on file. It's the same thing with these plants. Is like, now it's like you're flying down the highway and out of the corner of your eye, you see some pattern that you recognized before, and what you're driving past without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like that with any element of nature. Our brains are so amazing. I think a lot of us, kind of, there's maybe a philosophy that that I don't think TV helps this, but that maybe kind of when we're walking through a place, it's kind of like a television screen, and everything, you're just seeing stuff, and like maybe your friends or something like that you have an emotional connection to, but everything else is just kind of there, and you're kind of neutral. But it's not really like that. We have deep like connections and phobias against all kinds of stuff in the landscape, and we can never really see it from a detached perspective totally. And I really encourage people to try and use that talent to be able to connect with nature. I'm a huge proponent of using Western science as a tool to learn about the world around us, but I also do think that traditional cultures can teach us so much more. They have their own sciences that aren't as broken into pieces as ours, don't have the same profit motive that ours does. And I mean, we can all learn so much by there's an author, John Young, who he teaches a lot of different stuff, but one of his things he's most known for is teaching bird language. And so much of it is just understanding the body language of birds and what that can tell you. He can tell, and I've used his techniques to know, like, when a cat's going to walk by, because of the pattern of like the way the birds scatter.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of it is just it's not that complicated. It's just recognizing these little patterns in nature and what they can tell you. If the birds are like flying away from you, you're the problem. If the birds are flying past you like really fast in a straight line, there's probably a hawk.
Yes.
If a catbird comes up and starts, if you're chilling in the woods and a catbird comes up like 5 feet from you and it is like hanging out with you, it's easy to say, oh, the catbird likes me, but maybe there's a hawk around, and it knows the hawk is scared of you.
Mm.
There's all kinds of stuff you can learn. And what I was going to say with that is John Young, one of his things he talks about is how, you know, trying to be a neutral observer is a really important tool, but it should just be a tool. And that some of the stuff in bird language and nature study in general, you have to put away, you have to put that away and buy in to develop these connections. And then, you can come back and use neutrality as a tool. But if you're going around trying to always be unemotional, detached, and just an observer, learning about the observed, there's all kinds of stuff that you're going to miss out on, and you're going to think people are crazy when they tell you all these like stories they have about how animals can interact with you. Um, the other thing I just want to mention real quick is, I'm looking at your setup behind you, and it's ideal for this. One of the techniques we use is called a sit spot, where you go out into the woods and you sit there long enough for the animals to get comfortable with you, and you just observe and see how they are. Most of the time, if you're walking through the woods or something, you're scaring stuff away. But we can sit there in our own homes and just use our wide angle vision to relax ourselves and calm ourselves down, because our emotions, animals are really good at picking up what the big scary thing is thinking. Not like they can read our minds, but that they pick up on your vibe, they pick up on your body posture. And if you can learn to go into a non-focus where you're seeing a little bit blurry, but you see the motion really clear, just sit there and like, especially, snakes, especially the slower ones, you're going to see a lot. But with like lizards, especially, you learn so much about how they move around and what they do during the day, like, in a much faster way than with a snake or a tortoise or something like that. No, not that you can't learn from them too, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's a great point, and it just comes down to, you don't have to overcomplicate this. It's just about getting out there and experiencing nature. And I think, like we said, we ignore so much of what's around us because we're focused on our own little thing, that you actually don't stop and pay attention to the world around you. So I think that's all just such good advice for people, especially if you're keeping animals. You need to have that connection. It's not just about having the connection with the animals in your own home, but you also want to be connecting with the nature outside, so you can start bringing some of that information into your animal room. Do you want to spend some time talking about the Uromastyx diets? Because I know that's another interesting topic that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. And you'd already mentioned that you have some ideas, but you haven't kept one for a while. So I would love to know, and I think maybe it does relate a little bit to just the foraging and whatnot. So maybe I'll just let you take it from there.
Yeah. So I want to start by saying that early on during the pandemic, I was watching a lot of podcasts, and so many of the podcasts were about morphs and rat keeping. And but then one of those podcasts had Zach Loafman on, and he talked about how you can use Google Scholar to research. I believe he came on, and did he talk about the same thing with you, or was it something else?
Yeah, the first time he came on, we talked about Google Scholar and WeatherSpark, and.
That other podcast, actually, he talked about species and how there's no such thing as a species. And then through that, I'm pretty sure that's how I discovered you and watched
that was
that
at
episode.
Basically at the exact same time. Yeah,
that was huge for me, because I was unaware of Google Scholar, and it took me from learning from authors that were citing papers to being able to look those papers up myself and discover new papers. And so I've always done deep dives, but that and iNaturalist have been huge for me in terms of learning about these places. And so, even though I haven't kept Uromastyx, and I wouldn't pretend that I know a lot about keeping them, I have taken some deep dives. And I was thinking about moving towards getting one at one point, and then I decided they're too big for our current situation, and too much too much heating involved. But I started to research them then, and I joined some Facebook groups to see what they could teach. And yeah, I find the groups online about them to be really interesting. I had to quit all the like ball python and king snake groups because I was just arguing with people 24/7.
Yeah.
All the 30-year keepers that like would ask me for proof, and then I'd cite like five papers, and then it's because I'm not a real man or because I haven't kept for 30 years or whatever reason. But these Uromastyx groups are, it's like, there's some breeders, there's some people that are more on the naturalistic side, the advancing side, whatever, but that most of them are like some degree of pet keeper. Um, that like, and it's really interesting. A lot of people don't keep the way I would keep, but I don't like, I can get pretty judgy about a lot of keeping styles, but where I really try and draw the line is not getting judgy about people that are pet keepers, as long as they're trying. Like, I understand that they're not doing deep dives, like, and that's, maybe at some point they will, maybe they won't, but they're just trying to do the best that they can with their knowledge. And I found that, some people, when I like say stuff that's not maybe the status quo, will push back pretty hard. But more so than in other groups, I found a lot of people are really open to like rethinking their keeping. And so yeah, I've stayed in at least one of those Uromastyx groups and have really learned a lot. Um, uh, the one post that really started me like doing more deep dives was somebody asked if they could eat wood sorrel. It's a genus of small clover-like plants that are sour and have a decent amount of oxalic acid in them, which I know from foraging circles that lots of people are terrified of eating too much oxalic acid. But for some reason, it only applies to wild foods. It doesn't apply to
Spinach.
spinach or
Yeah.
kale or. But but the thing is that most of these plants have, so oxalic acid is an anti-nutrient, especially in large quantities. But a lot of these plants have tons of tons of nutrients in them that help to balance that out. And from learning foraging and from plant medicine, that's so often the case that if you have like not the whole plant necessarily, but a whole piece of the plant, like you're getting a whole like cocktail of chemicals that are all kind of balance each other out. And especially as part of like a varied diet, oxalic acid is not that big a problem. Sam Thayer, who I mentioned earlier, goes into great detail. John Kalis, another really good wild food author, goes into great detail about how a lot of these plants are not wildly dangerous. And I mean, you can find like if you go online, you can find like dire warnings about not drinking water with oak leaves in it, but it's medicinal. It's like the amount that you would have to have for it to be a problem is a ton, and the taste would override how much you would want to do that anyway.
What would be
So
is
so
that
anyway,
like the
go
tannins
ahead.
are toxic or something?
Yeah, the tannins, and they are toxic in huge quantities or even large quantities. They're another one that like in small quantities they're probably really important. That's actually something just real quick that I wanted to mention
Yeah, I was
is,
gonna ask
and this
that.
is a
Yeah.
this is another thing that I want to say, like having the idea and then actually implementing it, it's more complicated than actually implementing it. But if you have a reptile that maybe has been exposed to uh, um, germs and little critters and all that. Maybe it came in wild caught and all of that. providing one water dish that's completely clear water and one water dish that's had leaves of like oak or beech or something like that sitting in it. So they have a choice between the two. It might be a good idea because it those tannins are really good for gut health and they're antimicrobial and uh, they can kill worms and stuff like that, anti-parasitic. So yeah, just knowing stuff from my world greatly influences that. And so I mentioned that wood sorrel and oxalic acid aren't as bad as people often say. And I realized that I came across as though I was saying just because humans can eat it and be just fine, that maybe I shouldn't have made it appear as though I was saying that I'm 100% sure that Uromastyx is fine. So I did a real deep dive to see if I could back up what I had said or if I needed to apologize. And I found that Euros were eating plants that had oxalic acid in it, including one. Let me look at my notes. It's Haloxion salicornicum. It's a shrub in the chenopod family related to like lamb's quarters and stuff like that. And that plant is used in descaling locomotive engines because of its really high oxalic acid content.
Wow.
And Uromastyx have been recorded in the wild eating this plant. So obviously a little wood sorrel isn't going to be the end of the world. I mean, maybe, you never know. There could be some other chemical in it, but in terms of the oxalic acid, it's not a problem.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that goes to just, again, it speaks to our culture. We tend to be very do one thing. It's like mealworms are bad, but yeah, mealworms are bad if they're only eating mealworms. This concept of trying to replicate the wild means that they're not going to be eating that plant every day just because it has a high level of oxalic acid. Maybe that's something they only encounter once a month. So it goes back to it's the dosage that makes the poison. And if that is the only thing you're providing, then that's going to be a problem. But to replicate this foraging that any animal in the wild is going to be doing, they're going to be exposed to all sorts of different things. And I'm sure there are not that many outright poisonous plants that animals will be consuming. I don't know, maybe you do, but
and that's another thing I want to bring up for both humans, and I want to be very cautious with this, but for animals, eating small amounts of toxic plants is a normal part of everyday life, and it can help your immune system. My one friend is an herbalist and he eats a few apple seeds here and there. Apple seeds are toxic. Like, I eat garlic mustard and I eat it raw, and it is bitter and pungent, and I wouldn't want to eat a ton of it raw. And that's a good thing because it has chemicals in it that when you eat it raw and your body processes it, they turn into cyanide. So technically, you could get cyanide in your lungs and it would displace the oxygen and you die. But nobody's going to die from eating it because you would have to eat tremendous amounts of it. And it's not pleasant to eat. Most Americans wouldn't want to eat a bite of it, let alone enough to do anything. People take cough syrup made with cherry bark all the time.
Mm.
It has the same chemicals as garlic mustard does. And so the thing is, with learning about animals and their diet and learning about people and our diets, there's no such thing as just a toxic plant or just an edible plant. Maybe there's a few exceptions on the just a toxic plant, but plants are always some degree of edible, toxic, and medicinal. Usually the medicinal part is when you find that balance. And some plants are extremely safe. You would have to eat massive volumes of them for them to be toxic. But I mean, there's very few plants that you could fill your whole stomach with day after day, and it wouldn't cause a problem if you were just eating that one plant. But yeah, I mean, it's all about finding the dosage, and knowing what part of the plant to eat and how to prepare it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It reminds me of when I was back when I was an athlete. I remember one of my teammates was bragging about some sort of supplement that he discovered. He's like, "This is like it's super safe." He's like, "The LD50 is like 50 pounds for this stuff," and I'm like, "Isn't that the LD50 for everything?" Like
Yeah.
if you eat 50 pounds of anything, it's going to be a problem. But and actually, I think in reality, we probably have more issues related to the quote unquote safe edible plants in our reptile diet than we do with plants that may have some toxins. Talk to any vet, they're going to tell you that we're feeding way too much fruit, way too many high sugar, low fiber vegetables that are causing all sorts of issues like liver issues and kidney issues in our herbivorous animals because they're easy and they can
And ourselves.
And ourselves too, exactly. So we end up poisoning ourselves and our animals because of the blueberry tastes so good or whatever it is, and then so it's almost like a wolves in sheep clothing in a way that we forget to think about. Okay, maybe we do need to. It would be better to feed some of these slightly toxic things in a low amount than poisoning them with the good things.
Yeah, and I mean one thing, when you domesticate stuff, not only do you cause the changes that you want to cause that you're targeting, you often cause unintended stuff. And with animals, that's why I'm not big on morphs, is because, I think you're taking a risk when you move away from the wild type. Is it the end of the world? For most morphs, no. But, and then with our foods, most of the foods that we eat, we've grown to be bigger and to taste sweeter and to be able to eat more of them without causing stomach problems, and that's come at a cost. And so that's why I think, like, for our animals, as much as we can, we should be trying to feed not only a variety but as many wild plants as possible. Because I mean, if you look at the studies on the nutrients in a lot of these wild plants, like, I talked about garlic mustard, like, and I'm not saying it's safe for Uromastyx or any other reptile. I don't know. I haven't done the research on that. But for humans, it's like maybe tied with stinging nettle as like the most nutritious plant that they've ever studied. And I mean, once again, don't eat a ton of it, but adding that into your diet is so good for you.
Yeah, I've heard the nettles thing before, that it's super healthy, and there's so much of it that grows here in the late summer that it's all over the place. I should start picking.
Oh, it's amazing. Like, it makes such a good tea.
Does it taste good?
Yeah, it's not like my absolute favorite, but it's more of a neutral flavor than most.
Okay.
Most people, if they complain about it, it's that they maybe overcooked it. As a tea, it tastes amazing. As like a vegetable, if you overcook it, so you have to cook it to get rid of the sting. But if you overcook it, it gets kind of mushy and is a texture that many people aren't going to like. In terms of the flavor, it's fairly standard, and it's unique, but fairly standard vegetable tasting flavor. As far as tea or broth, it's amazing. With the tea, I like to make a super infusion out of it, which is where, like, an infusion is just making a tea out of it. You let it steep for 5 to 15 minutes or something like that, and that's good. It has more of a vegetable type, like if you crossed like a kind of standard vegetable with a little bit of like maybe like just a hint of bouillon or something like that. It has almost a like stew like taste, just a hint of it. But if you let it sit for like 8 hours or a day in the water that was originally hot when you poured it, the water gets really dark. and it gets this whole other flavor that's almost sweet. It's really weird. You know, when the water gets really, really dark and almost has like a bluish tint, just ever
Interesting.
so slightly, that it's going to have that flavor. And you know, I like super infusions. I will say though that, like anything, just use common sense. Our culture always thinks that more is better,
Hmm.
and once again, it's about nuance. So with nettles, they're extremely safe. And ironically, like, I'm into inverts. Nettles, their sting is the same thing as the urticating hairs of tarantulas and the bite of ants. In fact, urticating hairs on tarantulas, the urticating, that's a reference to stinging nettle, Urtica
Really?
dioica. Yeah,
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
yeah.
I do a lot of like trail, like mountain biking or trail riding around my area, and the trails get overgrown with nettles, so I'm constantly like trying to
Oh,
avoid
yeah.
my hands hitting them because it does sting, and it's more like an itch that's kind of annoying, but that's really interesting. So if you were to, like, let's say you had the space and you're like, I'm gonna go pick up a Uromastyx today, how would you approach the diet?
Um, and once again, it's so much easier to like cite an article and say, well, this is fine or whatever, than I would start with the tortoise table like so many people do. Um, but given my knowledge, I would push things. A lot of the plants that they say you can feed a moderate amount to, I wouldn't be worried feeding them a large amount as long as they had access to other stuff. And a lot of the stuff that they say is toxic, but it's not going to die if it has like one bite. I might give it the chance to have a few. So one of the things that I've really, kind of my innate understanding of stuff has been really influenced by your podcast and Project Herpeticulture and Liam and a lot of other people, is the choice based husbandry, and I'm huge on that. I would try and give them, you know, stuff from the grocery store that I know to be nutritious, and seasonally, especially as many plants as I could. One thing I would look into is whether common chickweed, Stellaria media, whether that's edible for them. I'd really be curious because that's something that um, it likes cool, damp weather. I think it would be really easy to grow inside,
Mm.
like just under simple lights. Because that would be something really easy, low input that is really, really healthy for them. I would give them plantain, not the banana, not the starchy banana plantain, but the lawn weed, the plantago
Yes,
species.
I know what you're talking about.
Um,
Yeah, apparently that's a good
so
cure for poison ivy or something.
it is. It is. It's good for pretty much any itching, sting. I remember. So there's a plant called jewelweed that's really well known for its anti-bee sting properties. And when my son was like maybe 5, he was jumping on a friend's trampoline and a bee flew right under his foot as he was about to land. And he was like crying and in pain. And I'm like, oh, I know where some jewelweed is, like 4 blocks away. I'm gonna hop in the car and go get some. But I was like, there's some plantain here, and I've heard it helps. So, I chewed up a little bit of it, stuck it on his foot, and was like, I'll be back in 10 minutes. When I got back, he was like jumping on the trampoline again because the plantain had done such a good job.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
that goes
No,
back
I
to like
have
the
had bee
traditional
stings
knowledge.
that it didn't do as good a job
Mm.
on. But I've also had bee stings where, yeah, it just killed the pain almost immediately.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really
that's cool.
astringent. So that's one thing about the plant medicine side of stuff that I've really been learning is so I was I was massively into foraging and learned a little bit about plant medicine just because they're so closely related. But the last couple years, I've uh, been learning a lot more about plant medicine, and so much of it, a lot of the like first aid stuff is this plant is good for that. Um, but as you start to get a little deeper into it, which I'm not claiming to be that deep, but once you get a little deeper into it, so much becomes less about, this book says this plant is good for this, and more it's about trying to read the person, um, like like trying to understand what their body is trying to tell you about its current state,
Mm.
and then figuring out what the qualities of plants are and how that relates to what the person is doing. So with a bee sting or stinging nettles or poison ivy, you can say this plant is good for that. But also you can be like, there's this other plant that I know is safe, but I also know that it's astringent. Astringent means it tightens the tissues and reduces inflammation. And so then you can start doing mild experiments. Anytime you're consuming something, obviously you want to know the boundaries that you're operating within. But if you know a plant isn't dangerous to you, and if you put it on your tongue and maybe chew it up a little bit and let the juices get on your tongue, and your tongue like feels tight and puckery, you've got an astringent plant. And then from there that anything to do with a tissue being inflamed, just use that. So the same thing that's good for a rash is often good for some kinds of stomach issues,
Mm.
so stuff like that. And so when you're talking about plant medicine and people, that's already something we've lost a ton of knowledge about, and people are trying to fit back together, and it's always a little experimental. When you start talking about plant medicine and reptiles, that's really experimental. And I, like I said, I want people to be cautious. But if if you know that the plant is safe for the animal, if you know there's nothing, so so it's more likely that an animal is going to have a different ability to process certain plants than we are, than it is that it would affect their tissues differently from us. Because
Mm.
tissues are different, but they're all kind of very similar. And so the safest way to like start applying plant medicine to reptiles is finding plants that are safe for them to eat, or safe to apply to an injury or something, and then figuring out what their tissue state is, and how that plant's properties would affect that. Because say like I've seen squirrels carrying mushrooms off to eat that would kill a person dead,
Yeah.
because the squirrel's digestive system can process that chemical different than ours can. But in terms of like the properties of how that affects the squirrel's tissues, it wouldn't be very different probably than ours.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That
So
makes
yeah.
sense. So if you were to you live in the northeastern United States. Let's say you had a herbivorous reptile. We don't even necessarily need to say Uromastyx, but and this may be too general of a question, but I'm wondering, are there certain plants that you know would be absolute go-tos that are relatively safe that you would think that you would go forward right now to supply to a herbivorous reptile?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned dandelion. That's one. The plantain I know is safe for a lot of stuff. I happen to know that a different species of plantain Uromastyx eat in the wild. Like I said, the tortoise table, it's really good. I I think maybe it's a little overly safe. Um,
Where
in
is that
some
again? Is
areas.
that is I know Phil's talked about that before. Is that a chart that is on a website or?
Yeah, just Google tortoise table,
Okay,
and
okay.
it goes through and lists a whole bunch of different domesticated and wild plants, and then gives you a little bit of it has, very safe, in moderation, and toxic. And I think it maybe has improved over the years. Um, I remember reading it once and being like, I don't know about this. It seems pretty basic. But maybe I was approaching it uh, without an open mind. And definitely the last time I looked at it a couple weeks ago, I was really impressed with it. Um, I think maybe also part of my impression of it was that people will take it and overemphasize the cautions that it does have, and that there's often more nuance in the little write up than what people do. The other thing I want to say is that I don't think there's many animals that are purely herbivorous, and um, it seems like that's being both in Uromastyx and other herbivorous animals. It's being understood that like deer, if they come across a nest of baby birds on the ground, they're not going to be like, "Oh, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat. I don't eat animal. It's free food." Like, should they eat a lot of meat? No, but like the same's true with Uromastyx, and to even a greater degree, the studies are saying, at first it was like they eat a few invertebrates here and there, maybe some beetles and some spiders. But that took a while for people to in herpetoculture to like really accept that. But that now it's starting to be like if somebody says they're purely herbivorous, most people are going to push back on that. And then it's like, well, some studies show they actually eat, a decent amount. The one study says that maybe 84% of the fecal matter studied showed only plant material, but the rest had something in it. Anyway, I found a recent article that is saying that they think that Uromastyx, at least Egyptian Uromastyx, are often scavenging um, other reptiles and maybe birds, definitely mammals. Also, domesticated sheep poop was found in a lot of the Uromastyx that they studied, and so it seems to me that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help just add nuance to the conversation in those groups. Um, and just to encourage people to look to the studies, like you know so one of the things that I want to say is I'm not judging people for being cautious. um I if you're a pet keeper or you're new to this kind of stuff, um be cautious. It's one of those things where there's pros and cons to all the different kinds of keeping. And it it if you're overly cautious in the long term, that that is a risk to your animals to a certain degree. But if you're new to it, err on that side.
Mm.
Err on the side of being cautious. The more you get into it, you know, dip your toes in, and always provide alternatives to any new food that you're putting in. Don't put them in a situation where they're like, I'm really hungry. I'm gonna eat whatever this guy put in my enclosure. Put them in a situation where they have multiple options, and they can decide from there.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and it's just a reminder that they are essentially wild animals, and they have the ability to have an extremely wide, varied diet, and in many ways that's a lot healthier for them. And so, like you said, you're not just jumping into giving the toxic foods. Get a handle of your animal, keep them for a few years, and then start to understand that, once in a while these little, like the oak water is a good example, something like that might be appreciated by the animal, and technically it's poison if that's all you would give them, but there's nuance to it, and there's the dosage is the key. So I think it's a really unique way of approaching reptile keeping, just because it broadens it in many ways, right? It's not this cookie cutter, very simple, they eat mealworms, they drink this. It's understanding that they fit within an ecosystem and they're forced to survive in that ecosystem, and it's not exactly the way it is on the care sheet.
Yeah, and just like, I mean, obviously it would be ridiculous to think that like a Uromastyx is out there like reading Google Scholar to see what it's supposed to eat. Keep in mind that they have taste buds. They have sensory systems. And so just like how I was talking about, if you have an astringent plant and you put it on your tongue, you can recognize that it's astringent. Just like if you put a bitter plant in your mouth, you're gonna know that that's a bitter plant. It's gonna scream out to you, I'm a bitter plant. Bitter plants have certain properties. Like these animals, they make mistakes sometimes. I'm not saying that animals have this like psychic ability to know like what's good for them or what's not. They make mistakes. But overall, they have sensory systems that have developed for millennia to be able to figure out, there's not a school. Different animals to different degrees may teach their offspring what they should eat and what they shouldn't. But there's no school out there for them to be like, this is safe, this isn't. They have to use their senses to try and figure out, like, is this something that's safe for me to eat, and how much of this can I eat?
Yeah, the one animal that does have schools about what to eat can't do it properly anyway. We mess that up all the time, and that's why, like, our taste buds are totally out of whack. And if you fast for a certain period of time, you get some of that back, and you have this way more ability to taste things. And I laugh at my son because he's only 2, and like the other day, my father-in-law had made him some oatmeal and put some chocolate chips in it, and he's eating it, and he starts to spit out the chocolate chips because they're just too sweet. And and
Yep.
it's not that we've encouraged him not to eat sugar. It's just that I think we have desensitized ourselves to how sweet things are in our daily diet, and we don't realize that it actually doesn't taste good, but you forget because we've just constantly eating it. So even us, we have this ability to innately understand what's good for us, what's not. We've kind of botched it by the poor diet we have. But like you said, you watch your animal, you give them the options, you have a base understanding of what it is you're providing, and you can learn a lot.
Well, and you mentioned oatmeal there. Like, if you have a sunburn and you ever happen to get a little oatmeal on it, you might notice, oh, this is moistening and cooling, and you don't need to like have somebody who's like trained in plant medicine to realize, oh, there's a certain property to this food that, like, oh, maybe I can apply that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, Nathan, this is a really fascinating topic. It's just a fascinating way to approach herpetoculture in general. And I think just everyday living, I think it's important for people to reconnect with that and just, like we said earlier, just appreciate what's around you. And everybody thinks, oh, I got to get out of my own hometown to experience nature. Well, you don't really. You can just get outside and experience it that way. And the value added to your reptile room is pretty much impossible to overstate, because there's just so much that can come from that. Is there anything that we didn't mention today that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Yeah, just 2 things real quick. First is, I love researching. It's one of my favorite things to do. If anybody wants help going on a deep dive, I'm not going to do all the work for people, but I can help you. Like, I can help point you in the direction, and I can do a lot of the work for you. It's what I enjoy. So please, anybody that wants to reach out to me, reach out to me. And then the other is just want to, and I'm still figuring this out for myself, but so I really appreciate you and some other people in herpetoculture moving towards using this hobby as something that can motivate us to help with conservation. I would encourage people to do that and to start taking it to the next level of encouraging decolonizing. And just like an example is New Caledonia. We have so many geckos that come from there. And so many of us enjoy researching it and all of that. If people can like start to understand what's going on there, the Kanak people who are indigenous to there largely want to live lifestyles that preserve the nature there, and are opposed to the nickel mining that is polluting large parts of it. If we could be allies to them, nickel mining has to happen as long as we have all these electronics and other industrial things. If to whatever degree we can rewild our own lives, that's great. But all of us are pretty much going to be using these electronics. But anyway, we can try and research where our animals come from and how our animals are affected by industry, and how the people that lived with them for thousands and thousands of years are affected by industry and our current lifestyles. Look into if we can give a percentage of sales to that, or I don't know what the answer is, but anyway, we can figure out how to support indigenous people. They are not perfect, but in general, like, biodiversity is preserved by indigenous peoples and destroyed by industry. So wanted to throw that out there.
That's really well said, and that touches back onto the traditional wisdom that a lot of this podcast was based off of, comes from those cultures that are connected because they have to be. And I think that's a really important thing to say. And I don't think anyone's even ever said that on the show before. So that's a great perspective to share. Can you please let everybody know where they can find you online?
Yeah, so I've got a YouTube channel that I don't update very frequently, but it's got a lot of plant stuff and occasionally animal stuff, and sometimes some skateboarding and some experimental music. Just look up Nathan Carlos Rupley on YouTube. You'll find it. The same thing with Instagram. I tend to post more of my nature photography there, but kind of a mix of all the stuff I'm into. Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I'll make sure everything is in the show notes for folks to go check out. And for the listeners, make sure you go reach out to Nathan if you do have a project you want to research or anything like that. It sounds like he's your guy to give you a hand. So, Nathan, thank you so much for being here. This was an absolute blast.
Thank you. We really appreciate it.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and bringing that topic to us. Again, it's one of those topics that has never really been discussed on the show, but I think it's something that quite often we trick ourselves into thinking that because we keep reptiles, we're interacting with nature. Like I said through the intro, elements of that are true, but we also have to make sure that we're outside enjoying nature, understanding how it works, understanding the complexity of it, and getting away from those black and white categories that we sometimes do fall into when we're keeping animals in captivity. Listeners, thank you so much for listening to the episode. I do hope you enjoy it. Please consider sharing it on social media or Facebook. That does really go a long way to helping support the show. You can also support the show through Patreon at patreon.com/animalsathome. The money there goes directly towards either my time, my equipment, or my editing costs and things along those lines. The Patreon really is the difference between the podcast existing and not existing. So if you want to support the podcast that way, it is greatly appreciated. Also, one thing that I always forget to mention, but if you do want to pick yourself up an Animals at Home t-shirt or sweater or even coffee mug, you can do that at animalsathome.ca/shop. And when you buy a shirt or a sweater or a t-shirt, $5 does automatically get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. I'll be gearing up to make my fourth quarter donation there soon. Actually, for me, talking right now, we're still in December, but I'm sure you're listening to this in January, so I've probably already made the donation at this point. But anyway, I digress. Thank you so much for listening to the episode, and I will catch you in the next one.